to restate some of the oxygen transported by hemoglobin. It's usually fully saturated, and the way oxygen is diffused across membranes from the alveoli into the capillary in the lung is it moves from an area of high pressure to low pressure. And the same thing when oxygen diffuses from the capillary into the muscle, it moves from an area of high pressure in the capillary to an area of low pressure in the muscle. And hemoglobin is usually 98% saturated with oxygen. Almost all the hemoglobin is bound with oxygen. And it's usually not the limiting factor to exercise because there's usually plenty of oxygen available. But sometimes people can be anemic, and that decreases the amount of oxygen they can carry. Other things that might affect exercise potential is exercising at higher altitudes. Atmospheric pressure is less at higher altitudes because there's less air at higher altitudes stacked on top of, when we go to sea level, it's a lot of greater pressure at sea level because there's more layers of air pushing down. When you're at higher altitudes, there's less air compressed, and so there's a lower pressure. And when we have lower pressure, we have lower partial pressure of oxygen, and so we don't have as much pressure to transfer the oxygen from the lungs into the capillaries. And so this just, if you look at the bottom of the diagram, it shows venous blood. Venous blood carrying carbon dioxide and very little oxygen is transported into the lungs. And at the alveoli, we see oxygen moving into the capillary because the partial pressure of oxygen is greater in the alveoli than in the blood. So it's going to transfer from the alveoli to the capillary. And just the opposite, the partial pressure of carbon dioxide, which it has picked up as a waste product in the lungs or in the muscle, is going to move from an area of high pressure in the blood to an area of low pressure in the alveoli, so it can be then released from the body. So the blood now is saturated with oxygen, and the capillary bed in the muscle, you find that the oxygen will be released from the hemoglobin in the muscle because it goes from an area of high concentration in the blood to an area of a low concentration or low partial pressure in the muscle. And here again, just the opposite. There's a lot of CO2 that's been produced in the muscle with exercise. So there's a greater partial pressure of carbon dioxide. So it'll be transferred from the muscle into the blood. And then that's transported back in the venous blood, and it will be released then in the alveoli. So we have something called AVO2 difference, or atrial venous blood oxygen difference, and that's where we look at the oxygen content in atrial blood or arterial blood compared to the oxygen content in the venous blood. And so when we have more diffusing of oxygen into the muscle from the blood, we're going to have a greater AVO2 difference. And that's what we see with exercise. We see more oxygen being extracted from the blood into the muscle. And then that oxygen can go into the mitochondria to produce ATP for muscular contraction. And so what we see with exercise is we see a widening or an increase in the AVO2 difference compared to at rest. And so some of those things we talked about before with the hemoglobin more apt to release the oxygen, things like muscle temperature, carbon dioxide production, those make that graph or that curve shift to the right, where we're going to see a greater release of oxygen into the muscle bed, and so we're going to see a greater AVO2 difference. And so we look at something called oxygen uptake. because the amount of oxygen our muscle uses, we need more oxygen to produce higher levels of effort or exercise. And so we can predict the oxygen uptake by the formula cardiac output times the AVO2 difference. So cardiac output being the amount of blood that we pump out of a heart in a minute versus the amount of oxygen that the muscle is actually using is a reflection of the oxygen uptake or the amount of oxygen used. We can, if you recall, our cardiac output can also be referred to as heart rate times end diastolic volume. That's the volume of blood in that left ventricle at the end of diastole, or at the end of filling, when the blood transfers from the atria down into the ventricle, and then minus the end systolic volume. That's the amount of blood pumped out of the ventricle at the end of systole, how much blood remains in there. So that's our cardiac output times the AVO2 difference, which allows us to predict how much oxygen is taken up by the body. And we usually express oxygen uptake in as milliliters of oxygen per kilogram of body weight per minute. And so when we talk about someone's VO2 max, that's the maximal amount of oxygen that a person can consume or use. And it's a reflection of a fit system, or the lungs' ability to transfer oxygen to the blood, the heart's ability to pump that oxygenated blood to the working muscle, and the working muscle's ability to extract oxygen from the blood and within the muscle produce energy, or ATP, for muscular contraction. So we use VO2 max as a reflection of someone's fitness level, which is reflective of all those systems working effectively to deliver oxygen. And so we measure VO2 max with oxygen consumption studies where as we have people do more and more effort, they need to produce more ATP for higher intensities of work. And so we will see that their heart beats faster to pump more oxygenated blood to the working muscle. The muscle is able to extract more oxygen, but eventually it'll reach a maximum level. And you'll see when you do oxygen consumption studies that the oxygen consumption will eventually level off because they've reached their peak capacity. They can't their heart can't any more effectively pump the blood, and their tissues cannot extract it any more effectively. This just shows usually at rest and with exercise, we have the same amount of oxygen in our arterial blood, and that's because it's always fully saturated with the hemoglobin's always fully saturated with oxygen. But at rest, we don't extract as much oxygen for the muscle, and that's because we don't need as much oxygen to produce as much energy, because we're not having the strong muscular contractions. But as people start to exercise at a moderate intensity, we start to extract more oxygen, and so there's less oxygen returning in our venous blood. And then at high intensities, we are extracting a lot of the oxygen into the muscle. And so in the farthest column, you'll see extraction goes up from rest to moderate to high intensity effort. And that's just a reflection there again of oxygen consumption. So we can talk about oxygen consumption milliliters per kilogram per minute, but we also convert it to a very usable terminology, which is called a MET. And a MET is considered 3.5 milliliters of oxygen per kilogram. So if someone is consuming oxygen, 17.5 milliliters of oxygen per kilogram, we just divide it by 3.5 and we come up with an easier way to refer to it as 5 METs. And 1 MET is the amount of oxygen our body needs and uses to meet our resting demands. So if we're sitting quietly, Usually our body uses 3.5 milliliters of oxygen per kilogram, which we just have an easy way of saying 1 met. So a met is a multiple of 3.5 milliliters. Doctors oftentimes use it to look at someone's capacity to return to work. Say their work requires them to function at an 8 met capacity. And so they'll do a stress test and they'll see how much oxygen they consume, they can maximally consume to see if it's reasonable for them to return to that level of activity.